Hi everyone. I work at Sage. I'm a security specialist, and I'm based in the office in Newcastle. So I've just come down here to do a talk today for you guys on chatbot security in particular. Obviously, this is a Northwest Testers gathering. I normally only ever do talks at security meetups, so I'm not 100% familiar with everyone's backgrounds, but I'd imagine that there's quite a lot of people who are the testers or developers who've got an interest in artificial intelligence, of which chatbots is one implementation. I'll try and keep that in mind. Just to get a rough idea as to what people understand about chatbots. How many people know about, have used a chatbot, for example? Could I have a raise of hands, perhaps, of those who've used a chatbot? Oh, okay, yeah, quite a lot of people. That's good. Okay, so this is not a massively technical talk, so hopefully that won't be too disappointing for any of you, but I'll go through some interesting kind of insights as to chatbots, how they've evolved, what that means for us as testers, potentially, and how we can go about testing them. So my background's mainly in penetration testing. I did that for over a decade before I was at Sage. And so that's I've just become relatively interested in chatbots in recent times. So anyway, the kind of key message that I want to get across in this presentation, the whole point of this presentation is to let you know that chatbots, I think they're a relatively kind of novel technology. They represent both kind of old and new challenges for testers. So what I would suggest is you don't feel as though this is necessarily a hard thing to do. There's already some existing security testing guidance out there which still applies, but in addition to that, there's also some relatively kind of novel approaches and considerations that need to be thought about. Has anybody in here actually done any testing on chatbots, just out of interest? Oh, actually, nobody. Okay, well maybe some of what I'm going to say is relatively interesting. So my talk is in two parts. So the first part is what are chatbots and why would we care? And I'm sort of, the we is, I'm trying to sort of look at it from the tester's point of view. What are the threats posed by chatbots and how would we test them from a security perspective as well? So section one. To start with, I sort of came up with a definition. So I just took this from Wikipedia. A chatbot, also known as a talkbot, chatterbot, bot, IM bot, interactive agent, or artificial conversational entity, is a computer program which conducts a conversation via auditory or textual methods. So, you could therefore imagine that you've got something like the Google Assistant, for example. That's an auditory one, or something like Amazon Alexa. There are obviously other ones available, there's a number of applications out there, even like PayPal and things like that you can actually sort of talk to, and many customer services type chatbots as well. So that's the basic kind of definition. In terms of actual use cases, there are quite a few. I would suggest that the customer services use case is probably the most useful, based on what I've seen anyway from a chatbot point of view. So by that I mean, so you could probably imagine those situations where you're on a website and you might get a pop-up asking if you want to be assisted, you want any assistance on a matter. You might actually find yourself talking directly to some sort of entity that looks feels a little bit like a human but might not be. You'd be having a conversation, just typing in a question. You might well be handed off to, to a real human being, but you might not know. And if you don't know, it's probably because the chatbot itself has done a good job of representing a human being. So I think customer service use cases are pretty relevant, but you've also got kind of payments as well. For example, I know that there's a chatbot or there has been at least one for PayPal, for instance, where you can share money, that kind of things. Accounting, obviously, working for Sage. Sage has got a chatbot that performs accounting actions for people. Food orders, you can actually order food via a chatbot. There's sort of fitness guidance and charity chatbots and many others actually as well. So I think with the customer service thing in mind, this particular meme seems quite valid. I mean, the amount of times people, the amount of time that people can spend sort of on hold on the telephone trying to get through to somebody. If you had a chatbot that could actually assist you with a common query, then that would be particularly useful. So I thought that was quite valid in that case. Let's go through some more examples though. Obviously, Sage has got a chatbot called Peg. You may or may not know that. So I don't know if you can see clearly or not, but on the screen here, there is actually, you can see that it's basically a contact in Facebook Messenger, and there are other channels as well that you can access it through. So you basically literally just communicate with the chatbot as a contact in your favorite messaging app. So something like Messenger or Slack or whatever really. So, you know, in terms of how you actually go about testing that, we'll get into that a little bit later on. I've got a few more examples for you as well. Domino's. So you can see again, there's a similar kind of screenshot here. So you can see that you could actually order a pizza through Domino's. I don't know if anyone's tried that. Has anyone tried that? Has anyone spoken to a chatbot and ordered a pizza? Did we do it tonight? So that's definitely something you can do. Have a look at the website. It's just an example of a chatbot that I decided to pick out. So now, perhaps one of the more kind of interesting chatbots that I've kind of come across recently is this one that allows you to sue somebody. So it's an example of a more, maybe, well, novel, I keep using the word novel application of artificial intelligence chatbots. So there was a recent security breach at Equifax. Rather a lot of data was breached, compromised. And a chatbot was set up pretty quickly that will allow you to sue somebody, sue the company, because so many people obviously felt the need to do so. Don't know if you can see that clearly or not, but you can see that you can initiate a conversation with this chatbot. It says, "Welcome, I am a bot to automatically sue Equifax for $5,000 US in New York. What is your last name?" So I just put Smith. It says, "Thanks, and what is your first name, Bob? What is your home number and street number, 10? Finally, what is your phone number?" I just lied. And it just gives, here is your PDF file, and gave you a link. So you click on the link, and you just get this form that you can send to the small claims court. So I think that's a very interesting usage of chatbot technology. It's not just about ordering pizzas or conducting your accounting online. But actually, that presents a few security challenges, doesn't it, as well? Things that you might want to test for. I mean, is that link really trustworthy? Who wrote the chatbot? You know, where does your data go? Those are the kind of things that I'll delve into a little bit later on. Even more interesting, I came across this other chatbot called Gentleman's Little Helper. It's not as dodgy as it sounds. It's just there to... It's simply a reminder for forgetful guys to say nice things to their partners. And I tried it. It popped up on Facebook roughly once a week or so and said, "By the way, Rob, it's been like, what, 7 days since you last said something nice to your partner. Have you thought about buying some flowers or something?" So yeah, that's not, that's like almost like a toy, really, isn't it? But then I found a few more interesting ones, like the angry, insulting Donald Trump bot. So people obviously create chatbots for serious reasons and also, dubious reasons too. But there's another interesting aspect to chatbots. Chatbots, the ones I've shown you are predominantly ones that are kind of scripted, so you kind of give predictable input and you get relatively predictable output as well. So in that case, it's quite easy to test, I suppose, because you've got predictable consequences for your input and different conditions that need to be met. But what about chatbots that actually learn or have some kind of machine learning? There was an example from Microsoft. They created, from what I remember, some kind of personality that was meant to represent a teenage girl, I think. It was called Tay, and it was on Twitter. Did anyone remember this at all? So I think it was designed to learn, but obviously because it's on Twitter, there's a lot of bad people there, and it learned how to be arguably not a very nice person, and came out with some inflammatory remarks. And as this person here is quoting, he's quite worried about what artificial intelligence could leads to software learning, and so that was pulled. There are also chatbots that could debatably create their own language. There was a Facebook AI robot which kind of was claimed in the media to have invented its own language. So I've given a kind of an excerpt of it here. Basically, kind of like I wouldn't really call that its own language. I would just call that I don't know, an interesting interaction. between Bob and Alice as to who may or may not wish to purchase something. But this is another example of something that's a little bit more advanced than something that's scripted, maybe arguably a little bit more intelligent because it's actually developing something new as opposed to just giving you a standard response. So maybe that's a little bit harder to test. I've put this comic strip in as well. Chatbots can be unethical as well, I suppose. So I think that's an important point. A lot of people are talking about how chatbots should have some kind of ethics built into them as well. So here you have this comic strip where somebody is. I am actually called Rob, by the way. You could be talking to someone on a dating website, for instance, and it might actually be a chatbot. I'm pretty sure that must have happened. You might well have been talking to someone that's not real, and they fail the Turing test or a captcha or something like that. So you might end up flirting with a chatbot. I don't know if you can see this slide very clearly or not, but I decided it might be quite useful to discuss the fact that chatbots are actually not exactly new technology, really. In 1966, there was the ELIZA software program, which was designed to mimic human behavior. Now, that's 1966. That's quite some time ago. So, chatbots. If you consider that to be a chatbot, I wouldn't necessarily say that chatbots are really that new. You've also got in 1972 something called Parry, which simulated a person with paranoid schizophrenia. I guess it's probably because the academics were experimenting with chatbots at the time, and they're trying to emulate various different personality traits or problems or what have you. And then obviously in 1992, Dr. Spatzer, I don't know how to pronounce that, it's a speech synthesis bot that took on the act of a psychologist. So maybe Dr. Spatzer could have treated Parry, I don't know. And obviously in more recent times you've got like IBM Watson, Siri, Google, and various different bots for Messenger and so on. So there's quite a few different implementations of chatbots these days. I'll speak briefly about the kind of chatbot channels that you have. So by channels, I mean the actually delivery methods of a chatbot. So I think we're probably quite familiar with the idea that you might use Facebook Messenger, for example, or Slack. But there are other ones as well, even email ones. There's even sort of chatbots out there that you can send an email to and they'll give you a response back. So you could actually be having some kind of conversation that's meant to represent sort of human behavior via email. Or SMS as well. And what's quite interesting is that some of these delivery mechanisms are more secure than others. So for example, email is generally speaking unencrypted, and as is SMS as well, whereas WhatsApp or Messenger I think are now encrypted. So those are considerations for those who might be in a position where they're doing tests against chatbots or doing some kind of security tests on chatbots. In terms of actual chatbot platforms, by platform I mean what are the actual building blocks? How do you actually create a chatbot? There's some fairly famous and well-known ones out there, such as IBM Watson, and the one in the bottom left there is actually the Microsoft Bot framework. And you've also got one called ChatFuel as well. Has anybody experimented with building a bot or using any of these platforms? Oh, cool. Okay. You'll probably know more about it than me, but I'll give you a security perspective on some of it. So how intelligent are chatbots actually? Well, they're designed to handle natural language processing. They're designed to have an awareness of human requirements, i.e. to get to the point of the conversation, which is to achieve a particular objective, a goal, provide assistance, or close a sale of a pizza or something, for example, or manage accounts, whatever really. And they should arguably pass the Turing test, which is the test whereby somebody who if a human cannot differentiate between a human and a chatbot, then the chatbot's been successful in passing itself as a human entity. So you can actually create a chatbot very, very easily, I found out recently. So you could actually do this apparently within 7 minutes, according to the Chatbot website. It's free to use. I played around with it, created a chatbot. It was just a contacting in Facebook Messenger. It literally takes no time at all. So you can actually create this kind of artificial chatbot entity and have create conversations and design how it responds to certain input, that kind of thing. And it was quite interesting, really. I'll show you a few screenshots from it just to give you an idea as to what the process is. So if you look here, you've got a blank bot. You get kind of like a welcome message. You get an initial message, a follow-up, timed after a while. But I think the main thing to remember is you've got the concept of blocks. So these are blocks of messages or communications, and you can structure and move these things around and apply logic to them. So none of this sounds really particularly clever, really. It's just like if the response looks a bit like this, then if the input looks a bit like this, then you might respond with something like that. It's just basic conditions that you could program into a chatbot. So nothing revolutionary there, but in terms of where the intelligence might be, you've got this kind of section here in Chatfield whereby you can kind of create intelligence. So on the top left-hand side there, you've got set up AI. So you can add AI rules. So in this example, that's a default one. Says if a user says something to, and you've got things that you can add, tags if you like, then it will either do something like show a video or give you a certain type of response. So it's quite obvious how you might go about testing that, because it's predictable input and output, more or less. The chatbot isn't learning; it's just pre-configured. So being someone who works in the security area, I've passed an exam called CISP, so I had to play around. And it's a 6-hour exam, so I thought, well, if users say something like CISP, reply with 6 hours, you'll never get back. So I just applied that very simple AI rule, and that's it. So I just typed CISP, and then Facebook Messenger just comes back with that response. So you can see how easy it would be to create a chatbot. You could do it for fun, couldn't you? You could have like a personal chatbot that is, whatever your name bot. Or you could, come up with something a little bit more useful. There's, in terms of the intelligence of chatbots, really. So there's been a couple of good Dilbert sketches come out recently, such as this one. So you could actually write a bot that is meant to impersonate yourself. Would it be useless? Or maybe you're useless, I don't know. I might be. And then there's another one as well. So it's been the butt of Dilbert jokes for a while, as have most technologies, really, or scenarios. But there was this interesting website came up about a year or so ago. I think it was called willrobotstakemyjob.com, and you can search for your job. So obviously, working in security, I searched for security, and it came up with this generic kind of classification. So apparently, there's only a 21% chance that my job will be replaced by robots in the near future, and so it gives you the automation risk level of no worries. So, so that's good, I guess. But I thought about you guys, and I thought, well, some of you are probably software developers, and I typed in QA testers, but it came up with the same classification. You're even less likely to be replaced, so 13%. So automation risk level was also no worries. So. That's good. I don't know how it worked out. I think it was a bit of fun more than anything. So that's kind of my introduction to chatbots and why we'd care about them. The next section is about how we might actually, a little bit more serious about some of the threats posed by chatbots and how we might go about doing some testing against them. So this is probably the bit where you might be more likely to get some insights. Well, the first thing that I thought is that chatbots is just like any other piece of software, therefore written by human beings and could be compromised. It's, at the end of the day, software, and software contains vulnerabilities because humans write it, unless, of course, it's going to be written by other chatbots or something in the future, I don't know. But there must be a source human somewhere along the line. Anyway, the most obvious resource for that kind of security discussion is the OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. I know that you've had security talks here in the past, so I won't go over old ground again. But there's a list of there's 10 categories of vulnerabilities, which is updated every few years by OWASP. And there's a list of the different types of vulnerabilities that software is can be exposed to, and I think many of these actually apply to chatbots as well. So you've got like injection attacks, broken authentication, sensitive data exposure. I think that sounds particularly relevant depending on what you actually say to the chat. Somehow external entities attack, that depends really on the processing behind the scenes. Broken access control, could you access someone else's data? Security misconfiguration, what about the underlying frameworks? Cross-site scripting, maybe, depends on the delivery method, like is it Facebook Messenger or what have you, and what validation they do. But there's basically, I could look at that list and think that, well, the chatbot is just another piece of software, and it could be vulnerable to many of these things too. And the question is, well, how would you go about testing that? Well, actually, no, let's dig into some more specific examples. So in terms of injection attacks against a chatbot, so you're talking to a chatbot on Messenger or Slack or what have you, could there be some kind of string injection? There's probably a natural language processor at the background. So something like the Microsoft Bot Framework has this thing called LUIS, which does natural language processing. Maybe you could, I don't know what input validation that has for what you supply to it, but maybe you could taint the way that that's processed somehow. I don't know. Broken authentication. The chatbot is probably talking to lots of people, not just you, obviously. So how would you, how do you authenticate to the chatbot? Is that handled the same way for various different delivery mechanisms? SMS or email? Because you might have a chatbot that is delivered not just through Slack or something, it could be delivered through lots of mechanisms. I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. Sensitive data exposure. Where does the actual data go? Who wrote the chatbot? Where's it hosted? Even if it's just a fun chatbot that you might be looking at, like some of the silly examples I gave before, but you might play with them, but you wouldn't really want to send them too much personal information if you weren't sure where the data was going. It's unencrypted as well in some cases, like SMS is unencrypted, whereas WhatsApp, I think, has got end-to-end encryption now. And there's a few more examples. I mean, what about the frameworks like the Microsoft Bot Framework? How secure are they? Could they be misconfigured perhaps by somebody setting one up? How would you test it? Well, I thought about the OWASP resources again. Obviously, there's the whole discipline of penetration testing that has been discussed many times before. But in terms of something that you could go to and pick up, you've got this thing called the OWASP Testing Guide project. It's quite an old document now. But I was looking through it and I thought, well, it is still relatively relevant, I think, for people working in a development or QA space. And it's free as well. But it does contain 224 pages, so it's really just kind of like a reference guide, really. I wouldn't read it end to end. But I've picked a few screenshots from it, but a few captures from it. So if you look at the actual introduction, it talks about testing techniques, and it doesn't seem to be specifically focused on what you'd call like the penetration testing community necessarily. So it kind of is, it's a few years old now as well, but it's still relevant to the whole testing discipline. And if you look at some examples from the contents, authentication testing, it gives you some very specific breakdowns about how to carry that out. Authorization testing, and for those existing types of threats and test cases, you could apply that, I think, to chatbots as well. There's a functional testers, security test section as well. And it does go into a lot of detail in terms of how you actually go about doing the tests as well. So it gives you sort of sample inputs and outputs and that kind of thing. So quite a useful reference guide. Maybe if you've not done a lot of security testing in the past, it's probably a good thing to use. And one of the most obvious tools that you might think of utilising is obviously OWASP's app, which I'm sure that some people here must have used before. It's an attack proxy. It's an intercepting proxy that you can capture requests and tamper with them and do many more tests as well. And it actually contains an API as well that can be driven by, you can actually be driven by automated test suites too. So they're the kind of threats and test scenarios that are quite common, I suppose. But what about the ones that are more novel, maybe arguably a little bit more specific to sort of chatbots themselves? Chatbots could be manipulated to attack humans. But obviously, the main end game for a lot of hacks these days is to actually achieve some kind of compromise or data retrieval from somebody, arguably. Chatbots could actually be created deliberately to attack humans. So you could have like a chatbot that's inherently malicious, that you'd want to. It's almost like phishing, but with the chatbots, you'd create it specifically to try to target people or retrieve information from them, or trick them into giving away information that they shouldn't really do. So I've come up with some specific examples here. So there's quite a few, like unlawful interception. I'm going to have to, some of the text is a bit small, I apologise for that. But personal, possibly financial, maybe even intimate conversations could be shared with a chatbot. If you think about, like, some of them might be set up on dating websites, that kind of thing. You might not even know that someone you're talking to isn't real there. Maybe a chatbot didn't encrypt the data or suffered poor software or hosting security. So, this is a situation where the data could have been compromised unlawfully. But there could also be lawful interception. By lawful, I mean that law enforcement agencies could actually gather that data and use it in evidence. And I think there's been a story where that happened in the last year or two for the Amazon Alexa device. I think that I did a bit of research, and because Amazon Alexa devices were, maybe they're not now, but at one point they were always on, always listening. There's some information recorded that was used in evidence in the US, which is quite interesting, I think. Personal identity theft. A chatbot could be set up specifically to con people into revealing sensitive information. You might set up a chatbot yourself, and you might be able to access the data that people send to it. And in those cases, that could contain a lot of information. You might have very personal conversations or reveal data you shouldn't. It could be personally identifiable. Where does that data go? Who wrote the chatbot? Corporate identity theft. I had this idea that maybe you could kind of masquerade as a similarly named resource, so like something authoritative, I don't know, something like a Pizza Hut, for example, without a space between the A and the H, or something like that. It's like a bit like domain squatting, really. Maybe you could set up a chatbot that's pretending to be some other corporate entity that it isn't. You might ask for payment data or something like that. Unauthorized conversations. There was a case recently where I think it was Burger King. It was in the news a while ago. I think Burger King created an advert which deliberately triggered Google voice assistants. So you could actually create an advert to actually have an effect on people's homes, which is an interesting threat indeed. So I kind of thought about that a bit more and thought about, well, what about smart homes? Internet of Things devices connected. Some people here might have like a smart TV or a smart home, might be using Hive or something to control their heating or something similar to that. Just wondered, because a lot of these, there's been a lot of vulnerabilities in the firmware used by these devices recently. I wonder if they could come up with some kind of coordinated attack that exploited something to make your home insecure or something. And then I thought about attack bots. What about if you just create a chatbot that is actually representing a hacker? I wonder if that is even possible. There's a lot of automated tools out there that you could run. You could maybe get a chatbot, script a chatbot such that it could attack you when you talk to it. I don't know. It's a bit pie in the sky maybe, but it seemed like a reasonable idea to warrant further exploration. So those are some of the examples of maybe more chatbot-specific threats, as opposed to the typical, OWASP top 10. So I thought, well, what advice could I give you, really? I suppose you could have a think about the fact that conversations could fundamentally include sensitive information. The chatbot frameworks, some of them are quite new, and any time that anything is rushed to market, it can contain vulnerabilities. I'm not saying that the chatbot frameworks are insecure, because I don't know if they are or aren't, but it's just a common theme for relatively new software. And there's also variations in the security offered by the actual channels themselves, as we've discussed before. SMS is unencrypted. Other channels such as WhatsApp are encrypted. So what would you focus your testing on? I had this idea that, well, I could give you some advice like this. So you could come up with encryption. You'd want to be looking at some obvious things, like is the data, the communications encrypted in transit and at rest? A bit hard to do with voice, obviously. But with obviously a text-based chatbot, you'd probably validate that somehow. The identity, you need to consider the identity of not just the bot, but also the user as well. We discussed how you could create a bot that might look like a corporate entity that it isn't actually. So it might trick people into communicating with it and revealing data. I think that the shared security responsibility is quite interesting because, what do you have to do as a developer? What do you need to test if you work in a QA function? There's the Chatbot framework, which is somewhat behind the scenes, I suppose, to a degree, if you're looking at it from a QA point of view. I won't go into the architecture of chatbots or anything, but then what does that do for you? Does that deal with things like input validation? Will that ensure that data is stored encrypted, for example? They might vary from one platform to another. The messenger channel itself, what does the messenger channel do? I'm pretty sure that some of the well-known messaging apps might actually do quite a lot of things like input validation that stop you injecting script and that kind of thing. But if you've got one chatbot that talks to a lot of others, it sort of uses a lot of other delivery mechanisms, and maybe you shouldn't assume that security is going to be built into all of those, and maybe you as the developer of the chatbot might need to think about including some defense in depth security measures. And data retention, obviously with data protection law and that kind of thing, you'd need to consider where the data is stored, if any of it is personal. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to show you. I know we've got a couple of talks tonight, but just to reiterate the message that I started off with is, chatbots are a relatively novel technology, but in some ways they suffer some of the same old security risks that any piece of software does. But also there's some new and relatively interesting threats as well that we can test for. So hopefully some of what I said might be useful to you if you actually find yourself either developing or doing any QA work on any chatbots. So thanks.